Well, hi folks. Today I'd like to talk about the chart of Ghislaine Maxwell, who's come into the news of late. Well, as of last year when Jeffrey Epstein was arrested and then died allegedly of suicide in his jail cell, pending revelation of all kinds of misbehaviors involving underage women, let's call them what they were, girls. Ghislaine Maxwell was alleged to be a kind of a procurer, longtime buddy of Jeffrey Epstein, and a woman who was a kind of a co-conspirator and confidant and participated in many of these sexual solicitations, seductions, and training of girls for the pleasure of Jeffrey Epstein and a whole bunch of other people. Prince Andrew, allegedly, Donald Trump, possibly, Alan Dershowitz, a whole bunch of people in those circles. So Ghislaine Maxwell went into hiding around the time that Jeffrey Epstein was arrested and has pretty much remained so despite FBI attempts to serve her summons to appear. Finally, they caught up with her, and she's been arrested and fighting, various steps of the legal process to deny her involvement or any testimony. Anyway, so on it goes, and it's shaping up to be a pretty messy trial scheduled for next year. What's interesting about Ghislaine Maxwell's chart is she has a Kala Sarpa configuration. Now, many notable people and sometimes notorious individuals have Kala Sarpa configurations in their chart as well too. It's a known fact of nature that snakes like to mate in swarms. This may be true of Maxwell and her circle. Donald Trump has a Kala Sarpa configuration. Sean Hannity does as well too. Prince Andrew does as well too. And I could go on and on, but that's not the point. The Kala Sarpa configuration is very interesting. It can manifest either as a yoga or a dosha, meaning respectively something good and beneficial in the life versus something that is, troublesome and a little bit, the underbelly of things with problems and consequences of an unsavory nature. There's a way to deconstruct that in the chart, and I'll get to that momentarily as I go through this discussion of Ghislaine Maxwell's chart. Just a brief bit of history on her. She's the youngest of children whose father was Robert Maxwell, who was a somewhat notorious publisher in England. I was originally, I forget now, Australian by citizenship, but Middle European, I think, genetically. He died mysteriously, apparently of drowning, shortly after he came under investigation for a lot of financial misbehaviors, including, basically raiding the pension fund of a major newspaper and other nefarious financial activities. Now, Ghislaine Maxwell became the beneficiary of a certain portion of his estate, and apparently she was favored among his children. But that sort of allowed her to enter into high society of England at the time, back in the 80s and early 90s. And she's used that as leverage to, gain access to New York high society as well too, where she met Epstein and Trump and many others. So that's just a little bit of backgrounder, and anybody wants to know more, feel free to have at it with Astrodienst or Wikipedia entries on Ghislaine Maxwell, where you'll also find her birth data. Okay, so enough for a background, and let's move on to the chart. So here is the chart of Ghislaine Maxwell, and for the uninitiated, let's define a Kala Sarpa configuration. So it is one in which Rahu and Ketu, which of course are always diametrically opposite, they establish this axis somewhere in the chart, through houses 1 and 7, 2 and 8, 3 and 9, as they are in this case, or any of the other house pairs. And basically, on quick visual inspection, you will see that there may be a planet or two with Rahu and Ketu, but on one side of the chart, there will be, for certain, at least 5 signs empty. So the rule for Kala Sarpa, depends on what you read. There's so little to read, though, by the way. In Shastra, it's virtually non-existent. Most of what we know about Kala Sarpa came courtesy of an oral tradition, largely out of South India. And so it kind of depends on, who your guru was and what access to, this oral tradition he or she may have had. So there's different definitions. There's what we call a perfect form of Kala Sarpa, in which there cannot be any planet in the same sign as Rahu or Ketu. And the 5 intervening signs will be occupied fully or partially. Those are the 2 more or less pure types. And then there's another 2 lesser types, wherein there could be a planet in the same sign as Rahu or Ketu. And there's one rule says that, the planet or planets concerned must strictly stay on one side of the Rahu-Ketu axis. And another lesser variety wherein the planet may stray beyond the actual degree position of the Rahu-Ketu axis, but the planet has got to stay within the sign. Now, in this case here, note the degrees of Rahu 27 and Ketu 27, of course, through Cancer and Capricorn in the 3rd and 9th houses. Now, if you look at this in Ghislaine Maxwell's chart, the moon is at 20 degrees and change. So basically, it's on the outside of that axis. So this is actually what we call a class 4 Kala Sarpa. It's the most common variety because it's the least rigorous, so something like 6.5% of the population will have this configuration. Kala Sarpa as a whole is relatively rare. Only 1 person in 8 will have it. Well, do the math, that's 12.5%. Anyway, there are different definitions for the 4 classes of Kala Sarpa. You can see my website, navamsha.com, Kala Sarpa, an article on Kala Sarpa, and I provide the definitions. And for those who want to dig much deeper, of course, buy the book by the same name, Kala Sarpa, and I go into a huge amount of detail. Today is just kind of a tease around all that. So back to Rahu Ketu running through the 3rd and 9th. Now, the first thing that we can do in analyzing any Kala Sarpa is pay attention to where Rahu and Ketu are. It's helpful to think of these two like a bar magnet, where Rahu represents the pole that exerts the attraction and some sort of a magnetic influence. So think of attraction. Whereas Ketu at the opposite end is something of a repulsion. So basically, wherever Rahu is in the chart, people are strongly attracted towards, compelled, feel magnetically attracted. Whereas in Ketu, it's a sort of an area of neglect, repulsion, ambivalence, lack of attention, and invoke a whole slew of adjectives on either side of that proposition to describe it fully. So here's the thing, Rahu in the 3rd house. The 3rd house is a house of desire. It's what we call one of the Kama houses, as in Kama Sutra. The 3rd, the 7th, and the 11th are the Kama houses. When Rahu is in the 3rd house, we get this notion of desire. I mean, yes, sexual desire, but also a broad form of desire where we say, I'd like to have a better car, or I'd like to have a good job, or I'd like to have a successful life. We're expressing a desire then, and the courage to act upon it. That's all well and good. 3rd house is also, associated with communication. And so person with Rahu in the 3rd house often is a bit of a schmoozer. They're able to do the meet and greet kind of thing. They have a certain degree of charisma thanks to Rahu's presence, especially with the moon. They are able to kind of force themselves into circles they might not otherwise be naturally welcome. They make good salesmen, and between a combination of the schmoozing and the manipulation, this is what they're really good at sales and marketing. And persuasive communication. At the other end of the axis, we get Ketu, which is, this mark of ambivalence or neglect or whatever. When it's in the ninth house, we can find, some sort of impaired relationship with the father. The father may be accomplished, but there may be a kind of weakness about the father. There may be a relationship that exists, but it is somehow flawed in some manner. And as a consequence, the relationship which a woman has with her father throughout her formative years will, color her subsequent relationships with men in her life. So we've got this basic construct. Ninth house is also about morality as well, too. And there we see, Saturn, which, is a dark force and malefic, although Saturn is in its own sign. It has a certain degree of strength. So one can learn a moral code, but perhaps from a father whose tough love measures might, teach one to be tough with other people. Meanwhile, Jupiter, which is the very karaka of ethics, morality, and dharma, it is, debilitated in Capricorn. And doubly, impacted by being in association with both Saturn and Ketu, two malefics. So Jupiter's morality here is suspect and inefficient. So there's this notion of flawed morality, and basic, is there a high purpose to this life? Well, that's moot or doubtful or debatable. So then the next thing we do after noticing where the Rahu-Ketu axis is aligned, we take note of the planets that disposit those two. They will become important operators in the expression of the Kala Sarpa. Remember that Rahu and Ketu always act as proxies. They function on behalf of planets with which they are associated, planets which aspect them, and the planets which disposit them. I'll get to the associates and aspectors shortly. Let's just deal with the dispositors. So Rahu's dispositor is the moon. And the moon is in its own sign, Cancer. So this is a very strong moon. It's in its own sign. And take note of where the sun is here. The sun is in Sagittarius. A full moon would have been in Gemini. So the moon is just one sign later. So this is what we call a full-ish moon. So this is quite a powerful moon between being in its own sign and being just past full. So this whole notion of desire looms very large in this chart because the moon is so powerful. But in association with Rahu, it takes a bit of a darker turn. In receiving the aspect of Saturn too, this moon is also affected in a somewhat negative way. Jupiter, softens that a little bit, but remember, Jupiter is debilitated, so it's not going to help that much. So anyway, moon is very powerful, and so Rahu is acting on behalf of a powerful moon, which, remember, reflects personality, behavior, the workings of the mind. So moon and Rahu together can make this person, a little bit on the dark and twisted side, if I may say that, because it is the very nature of the nodes to act in, underground, devious, serpentine ways. At the other end of it, we have Saturn. Saturn in Capricorn, its own sign. So these are two very powerful planets, Moon and Saturn, sitting on the Rahu-Ketu axis. So Saturn can act with a great degree of strength, perseverance, endurance, the protection of a father or father figures, because Saturn is Lord and occupant of the ninth house. Even in the judiciary, a person could find some favor because, this represents people in that realm. Now, the Rahu-Ketu axis, when it is influenced by malefics, it can skew into dosha territory. So here we have Saturn, a powerful Saturn on the Rahu-Ketu axis. That contributes to the dosha quality of the Kala Sarpa. Meanwhile, Mars, which sits here in the 8th house, combust with the sun, Mars aspects Rahu. So Rahu takes on the nature of both Saturn and Mars, both malefics, and lends even further dosha type quality. As I noted already, Jupiter will try to pull this back into yoga territory, but because this is a weak Jupiter, it cannot compare to a strong Saturn. And furthermore, a luminary, either sun or moon, on the nodal axis is also a doshic quality. Remember that the nodes are the enemies of the luminaries. It's by virtue of the position of the nodes that cause eclipses. So, in the mythology, Rahu and Ketu, Rahu particularly, chases after the luminaries and swallows them momentarily until they escape and then continue another cycle. So Rahu is seen as this devouring mouth of the nodal axis of the cosmic serpent that attacks either the sun or the moon. So in this case, it's attacking the moon. So we have three factors here for dosha type quality. Moon on the Rahu Ketu axis, because the nodes hate the luminaries. Saturn on the Rahu Ketu axis, because it's a malefic. Mars aspecting Rahu alone creates a dosha type quality. And Jupiter, although it tries to influence with a yogic kind of nature, it is weak and inefficient to do so. So, this is basically a doshic type quality chart, and problems often arise for that. Either the person causes damage to those around them, or they suffer damage themselves. Now, the Kala Sarpa configuration can act like a kind of magnifying glass or an amplifier, that it tends to bring out the best and the worst of the chart. And so then we look at other things in this chart to see, what's going on in here. So you start looking at yogas. Moon and Jupiter in opposition. This is what we call a Kesari yoga. It's a mixed strength Kesari yoga, because this moon is strong by being in its own sign and being foolish, while this Jupiter is weak because it is debilitated in Capricorn, and and afflicted by two malefics as well too. So that's a weak Kesari yoga. It can make for the schmoozer, but also sort of the party goer, someone who may run with a rough crowd, a mixed crowd, questionable company, etc., etc. There are many other yogas in here. In fact, this cluster of planets, 4 planets in the 8th house, which is itself one of the forms of a Pravraja yoga, but within this cluster there are no less than 5 Raja yogas, which means Dharma Karma Adipati yoga, a combination of a Kendra Lord and a Trinal Lord. I won't bother to go through all those, but they are there. Prime among them, however, let me just draw your attention to the most important of them. Ascendant Lord Venus with 7th Lord Mars. Here they are. Venus is just kind of off the edge of this chart, but that's Venus there and Mars there. So this is what we call a Dharma Karma Adipati yoga, or a Raja yoga, to say it more simply, because Venus functions here as a trinal lord. Lagnesh, Ascendant Lord, is always capable of being both a trinal lord and a Kendra Lord, because the first house is both. With Mars, who is the Kendra Lord in this case. So this is a very powerful construct involving other people, the self and others, in 8th house activities. Now, sex can be found in the 8th house or the 12th house. 12th house, pleasures of the bed. But this is the purely pleasurable aspect of sex, the pleasurable liberation, a cathartic kind of experience that we seek from sexual experience. Note as well, though, Mars is the Lord, and it's companion to Venus regardless there anyway. But the highlight is First Lord Venus with Seventh Lord Mars together here in the eighth house. The eighth house is the more commercial aspect of sexual experience because it is the money house of the other person. And so it involves a bit more murky behaviors, manipulation, transformation, and trauma as well too. I mean, most people in a normal life are not traumatized by sexual experience because it's something they enter into willingly. When it's a commercial proposition, you get underage people, you get people who are, strapped for cash and desperate to, feed themselves or take care of their families. And it's usually not a relationship of equals. And that's where the money comes into it. And it begins to dirty that whole relationship. So, allegedly, Ghislaine Maxwell has functioned as a kind of a procurer for Jeffrey Epstein first, and then, his circle of friends after that. It remains to be seen how this is revealed in court proceedings. But certainly, there's a murky nature to all this. Now, Mars and Venus form potently a passion combination. Aside from it being a yoga, potentially with influential people, of course, too, this pairing of relationships. Passion combinations are formed whenever you get two classes of planets brought together at the same time. What are those two classes of planets? Well, there are the ladies of the zodiac, which are simply Moon and Venus. And there are the bad boys of the zodiac, which are Mars and Saturn. When you get a pairing, one from one camp and one from the other camp, you have a passion combination which then can play out in positive ways, negative ways, or mixed ways. Now, Mars and Venus fulfill this. Mars is one of the bad boys, Venus is one of the ladies. Here they are found together in the eighth house, which is a house, of sexuality in and of itself, and of trauma, and of scandal as well, too. So, stay tuned. We have another passion combination in this chart as well too. Back to the Rahu-Ketu axis, note we have the moon here at one end, Saturn at the other end. What did I say? Moon and or Venus combined with Mars and or Saturn. Well, in this case, we have Moon and Saturn in a face-to-face, reciprocal, mutual aspect. And there you have another very potent passion combination involving the Moon and Saturn. Furthermore, both of them are strong. Moon is in its own sign in full, Saturn is in its own sign. Back to the Venus-Mars pair. Venus is ordinary in Sagittarius. Mars, ordinary by sign, but it is combust within 3 degrees of the Sun. And that may reflect upon some collateral damage that may be done vis-a-vis this scandal to other people. We look at Prince Andrew alone, for instance, got in trouble already, virtue of these, revelations and allegations that are swirling around him. So back to Ghislaine Maxwell, 2 passion combinations and counting, and there is a third one, although it's one-sided. Mars aspects the moon, and so that's a contact. It's not full-blown because the moon does not reciprocate. So we've got 2 full-blown instances of this, and a sort of a half combination as well too. So suffice to say, there's a lot going on in this chart vis-a-vis the passion combos. So there we are, and of course, in terms of timing, some interesting things have been going on of late. Back in Christmas of 2019, there was an eclipse, and that eclipse fell on the exact degree of Ghislaine Maxwell's sun. Now, the sun represents, in the chart, many things: mother, home, property, but also on a psychological level, happiness. So there is an outright disturbance to happiness. Her sort of sense of anxiety must have got ramped up, almost a year ago when Jeffrey Epstein was arrested and jailed, and and subsequently died in custody. It must have freaked her out, and she went into hiding for pretty good reasons, I'd say. But anyway, the eclipse came along end of 2019. That sort of escalated all of this as well too. Remember, eclipses are associated with the nodal axis and the cycle. So, you know, the Rahu Ketu orientation had been working its way through Sagittarius, Gemini for roughly a year before that particular eclipse came along. And in fact, this is one of the sort of problematic functions of Kala Sarpa. Because of Kala Sarpa, and it forces, you know, all of the planets to be restricted to one side of the chart, you will often get this phenomenon of bunching up, as you have in this case. Pravraja yogas and this cluster, or stellium as they say in Western astrology, is much more predominant in Kala Sarpa configurations. And therein lies the risk, because as a Rahu Ketu transits pass through this cluster, provokes the possibility of eclipses occurring within that very cluster or in direct opposition to it, as the case may be. And then, of course, if you get transits of the outer planets as well too, you can get more of the same. So, you know, in 2018 and 2019, Saturn was working its way through Sagittarius. You know, during the era when Epstein was arrested and died in custody, Saturn was in Sagittarius, affecting all four of these. Now, Jupiter is there still for this for part of this year before it goes into Capricorn. But Ghislaine Maxwell has already enjoyed, can we say that, her Saturn return. The first hit for that was in March, and then it went a little bit beyond that particular degree, then retrogressed, and was again right on her Saturn, transiting Saturn on natal Saturn when she was arrested. And of course, it'll remain there in this sign for another 2 years during the proceedings, you know, her legal proceedings, the trial, the revelations, well, possible incarceration and everything that comes out of this. You know, it's all set to be a little bit of a mess. But there you go. This is what happens with Kala Sarpa configurations, especially when they are of the Kala Sarpa dosha variety, which this one certainly is. So, as they say in, you know, arts and entertainment circles, stay tuned for more information, and we'll see what else happens vis-a-vis this particular chart. So just to conclude, as I went through that whole discussion, looking at Ghislaine Maxwell's chart, mea culpa, I forgot to mention that she is in Mars dasha. Now I'll let you go back and look at that chart on your own. But what is salient about that particular circumstance is that, remember, Mars is the Lord of the 7th house. It's one of that cluster of planets in the 8th house. Mars is combust. Mars is the 7th Lord. Mars forms a passion combination with Venus, who is the Lord of the 1st. So put all that together and you will naturally draw the conclusion that during Mars dasha, the Lord of the 7th and the 12th, Mars, in the 8th house, so double dushtana, you know, evocation in this particular case, 8th and 12th by occupation and ownership, whereas Mars is the Lord of the 7th, combust, there is going to be collateral damage of some sort coming out through all of this. Now, it's a given that already Prince Andrew's reputation has been tarnished. It remains to be seen whether further revelations, you know, demote him even further in the public eye. You know, Donald Trump is someone else who's trying to distance himself from both Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. Other people like Alan Dershowitz doing the same, and there may be others. Well, there almost certainly are many others. I'd be remiss in not mentioning Bill Clinton as well too. Google it. There is a whole slew of people that have been involved in this. Now, if the court proceedings allow, you know, the opening of certain of these documents and previously sealed statements as a consequence of interviews, there can be even more collateral damage than that which we already know. And that would be entirely in keeping with what we see from this particular chart. Yes, she will be hurt. She may very well be incarcerated, but the damage will certainly be done to several others during all of these proceedings as well too. So for anyone who's interested in Kala Sarpa, whether you have it in your own chart or whether you have clients with Kala Sarpa, chances are 1 in 8 of them do have a Kala Sarpa. Keep in mind the broader definition than what you might read in some sources. My book, Kala Sarpa, goes into the subject in great detail. Even in the absence of a Kala Sarpa chart, in your own chart or friends or family members or clients, I've done an exhaustive review of what it means to have Rahu and or Ketu in any of the houses in the rotation through the full cycle. And so there's a wealth of information there that can help you in any interpretation involving the nodes. Okay, good luck with all that. Stay tuned. Please like my presentation, and if you want to see more of this sort of thing, whether it's Kala Sarpa or any other subject that I'll be touching upon, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thanks. Have a great day. Bye.